You have heard from Old Testament witness and the New Testament witness, now the witness of the church. I was asked by Presbyterians for the Kingdom folks at their conference a day or so ago that about which period of the history of the church was the most proved to be most encouraging. And all the speakers gave different answers, but my answer was the church in Germany during the Third Reich. And my wife and I have spent most of our lives, I guess all of our married life, I've forgotten how many, that's 36 years. And so we've been thinking about this, and some of you know that Malta is writing a book about women in the confessing church. And so we talk about the confessing church, the people, the congregations, the pastors, and there are just so many faithful witnesses and they come and they made such great sacrifice. And probably the most famous, most prominent is Dietrich Bonhoeffer. And many of you know the story of Dietrich Bonhoeffer, the story of a young Lutheran pastor who stood courageously for the gospel of Jesus Christ and resisted the Nazification of his church, who eventually decided to join a plot to assassinate Hitler, and who was hanged as a consequence of his involvement in this plot. Bonhoeffer's life has inspired so many. He bore faithful witness in one of the most severe periods of testing of Protestants in the 20th century. Where would Protestants be on the world stage in the 20th century without his witness? He was a strong, resolute, and courageous young theologian who confessed the faith and not only wrote a book about the cost of discipleship, but paid the price for it with his life. Under enormous pressure, he stood bold and unbending in the face of great temptation. He was unwavering, unyielding, firm, and unflinching in his commitment to lay down his life for the sheep. Yet Bonhoeffer was not always so bold, unbending, and unyielding. Few biographers mention it, but there was a brief period when he was not so firm and unflinching, nor so strong, resolute, or unwavering. There was a time when he was quite weary, confused, and anxious. I don't know if any of you have ever had times when you felt quite weary, confused, or anxious, but I have. And I thought it might be helpful to think with you about this time in Bonhoeffer's life in the context of his longer journey, which I'll talk more about tomorrow. And I would like to, at this time, to ask if there's anything we can learn from his journey about our longer journey, and to ask if, and I'm going to show a lot of pictures here at first, and then I want to look with you rather closely at a letter. I want an exchange that some of you may not have. I hope it's been distributed. It's a letter from to Dietrich Bonhoeffer to Karl Barth, and to Karl Barth to Dietrich Bonhoeffer. And they're out there, and for you, if you haven't received one, raise your hand. Somebody will give one to you. Okay. As many of you know, Bonhoeffer grew up in a prominent, highly educated family in Berlin, the sixth of 8 children, the youngest of 4 sons. He had a very, the children in this family were highly well educated. Carl Friedrich is the one with the uniform on. He's going to go and study physics, going to end up splitting the atom with Einstein. The other brother, Walter, is going to be killed in the war. And then there's Klaus, who is going to be a lawyer for Lufthansa. And then there's Dietrich on the left. Dietrich's father, Karl, was a world-renowned psychiatrist and neurologist on the faculty of the University of Berlin and director of the famous University Hospital Charité. Charité, I don't know if it's pronounced that French or German, but biographers claim he was ambivalent, Karl, the father, about religion, if not an agnostic. What is clear is that the Bonhoeffer family rarely went to church. Dietrich's older siblings saw the church as a pathetic, mediocre institution that existed primarily to promote middle-class values. So, when he announced at age 14 that he was going to become a theologian, his older siblings teased him and told him the church into which he proposed to devote himself was a poor, feeble, boring, petty, bourgeois institution, to which young Dietrich replied to his older siblings, in that case, I guess I'll just have to reform it. He began his studies at the University of Tübingen in 1923 when a debate erupted in the pages of the most prestigious church journal, Die Christliche Welt. It was between the most esteemed, influential, and internationally renowned scholar in Germany and perhaps in the world, Professor Adolf von Harnack, and a young pastor from an obscure Swiss village who had just written a commentary on Romans named Karl Barth. A theological revolution led by Barth was emerging and attracting younger pastors and theologians in Germany, including Bonhoeffer. Professor von Harnack was trying to put a lid on it, and his article that he wrote in the Christliche Welt was entitled 15 Questions to Those Among the Theologians Who Are Contemptuous of Scientific Theology, to which Barth immediately responded, 15 answers to Professor von Harnack. Caught up in this revolution, Bonhoeffer returned to Berlin the next year to study under Harnack, who was a friend. Harnack was a friend and colleague of his father. Despite his family connection, Dietrich's classmates reported that he repeatedly challenged Professor von Harnack in class, defending the theological revolution of which he was a part. Bonhoeffer was a brilliant student of theology. At the age of 21, he wrote a brilliant doctoral dissertation entitled Sanctorum Communio. We'll talk more about that tomorrow. What is remarkable about it is not only the content, but the fact that he defended this dissertation under the most liberal theological faculty in the world. His teachers, von Harnack, Karl Holl, and Reinhold Seeberg, were all renowned theological liberals. And despite their profound disagreements, Bonhoeffer respected them and they respected him because he had earned their respect through his scholarship. They respected him so much so that the following year in 1931, they approved him as a lecturer in systematic theology at the University of Berlin. By 1931, however, it was clear that the Weimar Republic, Germany's first experiment in democracy, was failing. It's impossible now to go into detail, but the social, economic, and political pressures were enormous. Fear of a Bolshevik revolution loomed, scaring many Germans, including most Christians, practically out of their wits. Thus, on January 30th, 1933, Adolf Hitler was sworn in as Chancellor of Germany, having been democratically elected with a third of the electorate. On February 27th, the Reichstag, Germany's main government building in Berlin, was set ablaze, allegedly by a young Dutch communist whose name was Marinus van der Lubbe. The Reichstag was about the size of the Capitol building in Washington, D.C., and was completely gutted by the fire, which sent the nation into a panic. It was, for Germany, a 9/11 experience, only worse. because it demonstrated, according to the Nazis, how dangerous and desperate the communists were, and there was some truth in that. A state of emergency was declared on February 28th, which was the first step towards suspending civil rights, such as the right to privacy, freedom of speech, freedom of the press, freedom of assembly. On March 23rd, look how fast this all happens. On the 23rd of March, a law for removing the distress of the people in Reich was enacted, which transferred legislative power from the parliament to the chancellery, giving Hitler unprecedented powers to declare martial law and to turn Germany essentially into a police state. On April 7th, a law for the restoration of the professional civil service was passed that prohibited any non-Aryan from holding public office, including professors, teachers, and ministers in the German evangelical, that is, Protestant church. Pastors are considered civil servants, and if you could not demonstrate that you were Aryan, had Aryan descent, you could not be a pastor. Days later, Bonhoeffer delivered a lecture, The Church and the Jewish Question, in which he stated that the church is obliged to aid the victims of state action, even if they do not belong to the Christian community. If this fails, he said, the church must act not just to bandage the victims under the wheel, but to jam a spoke in the wheel itself. Bonhoeffer spent the next 6 months rallying the church, helping its leaders to understand what was happening and to recognize that they were facing a confessional crisis, a status confessionis, a time when the church must speak and act or else betray the gospel of Jesus Christ. But the German evangelical church was deeply divided, and various groups in the church had different ideas about what to do. There was a younger group of pastors known as the Young Reformers who wanted to split and to start a new free church, independent of the main body. Second, there was another group called the Young Church, the Junge Kirche, and who took a tread softly and take it easy attitude, as it was described, toward what was happening. Take it easy. Well, let's see what happens. And then third, there was the so-called Deutsche Christen, the German Christians, a highly vocal vocal minority who stood in favor of a Nazified church, a church that was aligned with the values and reforms championed by the new Nazi government. Indeed, if there was ever a group convinced they were on the right side of history, it was they. It was in the middle of this boiling cauldron, ecclesial cauldron, that Bonhoeffer bore witness to Jesus Christ by teaching, preaching, exhorting, admonishing, debating, persuading, having meeting after meeting, one hard conversation after another, trying to convince his friends, his students, and his colleagues to go in one direction rather than another. It must have been exhausting. Yet he was there in the middle of what came soon to be known as the Kirchenkampf, the church struggle. He was there when Karl Barth, the professor of dogmatics now at the University of Bonn, published a pamphlet on June 25th entitled Theological Existence Today that awakened many in Germany and throughout the world to the crisis in the German church, and not only the church, but to the crisis the German people now faced. And Bonhoeffer came to know Karl Barth personally when he attended a seminar Barth taught at Bonn in 1931. Barth became his mentor. They corresponded. He became not only increasingly close, but also helpful to Barth, because Bonhoeffer was not only a bright young theologian, but he was also a Berliner who had his finger on the pulse of much that was going on in both the church and the state. Bonhoeffer was also helpful to Pastor Martin Niemöller in organizing what was called the Pastors' Emergency League. Niemöller was a decorated U-boat commander in the First World War whose patriotism no one could question. He sent out a 4-point pledge to all the ministers of the church, asking them whether they would still stand according to their ordination vows, bound solely, quote, to Holy Scripture and to the confessions of the Reformation, and would, on the basis, would reject the so-called Arian paragraph as a violation of their confessional stand. 7,000 pastors responded. Throughout the spring and summer of 1933, Bonhoeffer was in the middle of it all, delivering lectures, preaching sermons, writing letters, drafting essays, and using his diplomatic and interpersonal skills to gather, inform, awaken, and motivate church leaders to act. More and more, they looked to him for leadership. But then abruptly, in mid-October, when so much was still up in the air, when so many decisions had yet to be made, when most pastors still had no idea what a confessing church was, let alone what it would cost to become one, amid all this chaos and confusion, Bonhoeffer simply walked away. He left Germany to serve 2 small congregations in London, German refugee congregations, and many people wondered why. On October 24th, a week after arriving in London, he wrote to Barth to explain. He said that he wanted to write 6 weeks ago, and why I did not write you then is now almost incomprehensible to me. This is in I gave you. You can look at it in more detail later. I'm just going to give you some highlights. He said, I knew that you were busy with 1,000 other things. He told Barth that he knew he should have asked him first, but he said, I knew that I would have to do what you told me, and I wanted to remain free, so I simply withdrew myself. He asked Barth to forgive him, and then he explained, I simply did not any longer feel up to the questions and demands which came to me. I was afraid I would go wrong out of obstinacy, and I saw no reason why I should see things more correctly, better than so many able and good pastors to whom I had looked up. And so I thought that it was probably time to go into the wilderness for a while and simply do pastoral work with as little demands as possible. The danger of provoking a reaction at the present moment seemed to me greater than that of going off for some quietness. So off I went. Bonhoeffer talked about having wanted to be a pastor, about his pastoral duties, and about his desire to do ecumenical work, not least for the sake of the German church. But he said, I receive news almost daily from Berlin about the state of affairs. That almost tears one apart inside, he said. And now you will soon be in Berlin, and I cannot be there. It also occurs to me that I have let you down personally by my going away. Perhaps you will not understand that, but he concluded, I think of you and your work very often, and where would we be without it? Would you please let me have your frank opinion on all this? I would be ready and thankful, I think, even for a sharp word. Well, he got one. I wanted to share this exchange with you because, as I said, few biographers even mention it, and none give it the attention it deserves. And I believe it had a profound, and I think you will see, it had a profound influence on Bonhoeffer. It's certainly given me a lot to think about over the years, and I wonder if it has anything to say to you. It is deeply personal, but it gives deep insight into how theology mattered to these two men at one of the most stressful periods of their lives. And even if you've never read one page of Barth or Bonhoeffer, I think you can understand what is at issue here. Bonhoeffer had said he wanted a sharp word, if necessary. Well, Barth begins this way. He says, "You can infer from the way in which I address you that I do not consider your retreat to England as anything but a necessary personal interlude. Once you had this matter on your mind, you were quite right not to seek my wise counsel first. I would have advised you against it entirely, and probably by bringing up my heaviest guns. And now, as you mention it to me after the fact, I can honestly not tell you anything but hurry back to your post in Berlin." What is all this about getting distance? The quietness of pastoral work at a moment when you are needed just now in Germany. You who know as well as I do that the opposition in Berlin and the opposition of the church in Germany as a whole stands inwardly on such weak feet, that every honest man should be fully absorbed in making our opposition sharp and clear and firm, that now perhaps everything is falling apart, not because of the supposedly great power and cunning of the German Christians, the Nazified Christians, but because of the pig-headedness, stupidity, and desperate shallowness of all people, the anti-German Christians. In other words, it was not the Nazified German Christians that they were so strong or clever. It was that the other groups were so weak, dull, and superficial theologically. Bonhoeffer had expressed a similar frustration working with these groups, and now he risked losing friends. He told Barth, "I felt that I was incomprehensibly in radical opposition to all my friends, that my views of matters were taking me more or less into isolation. Although I was and remained in the closest personal relationship with these men, and all that made me anxious, made me uncertain." Barth said bluntly what Bonhoeffer tried to say politely. Working with such groups was indeed frustrating, worse than herding cats, which is why the unity granted 6 months later at Barmen was such a miracle, an utter miracle. Neither man knew such a miracle would come, but that didn't absolve them of doing their duty now, Barth said, which is why he told Bonhoeffer he could not just go run away. One can now, Barth says, cannot now under no circumstances play Elijah under the juniper tree or Jonah under the plant, but must shoot with all barrels. What use is the praise you lavish on me from the other side of the channel? What use was he talks about a message a student gave him, and he said, when I was having it out with the brilliant council of brethren of the Emergency League, instead of you being there and supporting me against these brethren. Barth was sarcastic in referring to the brilliant council of brethren of the Emergency League. He did not think they were brilliant. Their leader was Martin Niemöller, the former U-boat commander, whom Barth was just getting to know. Niemöller, you might say, in some ways was a piece of work. He was used to giving orders, not taking them. Even his colleagues in the ministry said that sometimes when he spoke, they could have sworn they were hearing a commanding officer giving orders at mess. But what he lacked in theological knowledge or tact, he made up for in courage. Later in 1952, Barth said their relationship had gone sort of like this. "Martin, it amazes me that despite drawing upon so little theology, you still almost always come out at the right place." To which Martin Niemöller would reply, "Carl, it amazes me that despite drawing upon so much systematic theology, that you still almost always come out at the right place." They were so different. So different. and had different gifts and personalities, but having stood together, they could laugh about it in 1952 because they did not let such differences stand in their way in 1933. They both knew the stakes were simply too high, which is what Barth was trying to communicate to Bonhoeffer. He goes on in the letter, "Look, I have now been in Berlin twice in recent weeks, and I think I know rather well what is going on there. I have also tried my best to grab the helm and steer in a different direction, and I have also had some degree of success, but if things are to turn out well, I will need a quite different kind of success. And so I went away from the place very depressed, particularly the second time. Why weren't you there to pull on the sail with me? That sail, the sail that I could hardly raise myself. Why weren't you there? Why aren't you always there, where now so much could depend on there being a few courageous people on the watch at every occasion, great or small, and trying to save what there is to save? Why? Why?" Barth turns in the screws here. But he, too, was feeling enormous pressure as the leader of the emerging confessing church, and it's understandable why he wanted Bonhoeffer at his side in these meetings. Bonhoeffer was a highly respected young theologian in Berlin. He'd paid his dues and earned the right to be heard in the academy and increasingly also in the church. At the University of Berlin, he was the only student asked to speak at Professor von Harnack's memorial service in 1930 when he died, an extremely high honor. He was also an extremely popular lecturer, Bonhoeffer. He drew 300 students to his lectures on creation and fall in the winter semester of 1932 and 33. 300 students, can you imagine? Bonhoeffer was a credible, articulate, and effective leader from such a prominent, well-connected family in Berlin. It is easy to understand why Barth wanted him near. He tells Bonhoeffer that he has a splendid theological arsenal, and he ought to be a little ashamed not to be using it in comparison to others. He says this, "Look, I gladly assume, as I have already said, that this retreat was personally necessary for you. But I must be permitted to add, what does even personally necessary mean at the present moment? I think that I can see from your letter that you, like all of us, like all of us, are suffering under the quite enormous difficulty of taking certain steps in the present chaos. But should it not dawn on you that that is no reason for withdrawing from the chaos? That we are rather required in and with our uncertainty, even if we should stumble or fail 10 times or 100 times, to do our bit, whether we then help our cause or damage it? I will just not allow you to put such a private tragedy on the stage in view of what is at stake for the German church today, as though there were not time afterwards when, if God will, we will have gotten a little ways out of the mess again for the study of the different complexes and inhibitions from which you suffer, as indeed others must also. No, to all the reasons or excuses which you might perhaps still be able to put in front of me, I will give only one answer, and the German church, and the German church. Until you are back again in Berlin to attend faithfully and bravely to the machine gun which you have left behind there." So Barth rejects all Bonhoeffer's excuses and special considerations, and he grants that this retreat was necessary, but he says, what does even personally necessary mean? Barth refuses to let Bonhoeffer set personal considerations up as an obstacle to discipleship. And if those of you who have read Cost of Discipleship, you will remember that Bonhoeffer examines in great detail the various personal excuses various would-be disciples give in Luke's gospel. That's a great deal of what the Cost of Discipleship is about. Of course, both were challenging a basic premise of modernity namely the idea that we are first independent, self-determining agents, individuals, persons before we belong to God or before we are called by God, that we are persons apart from our call. And Bart and Bonhoeffer are challenging this, that we have an identity apart from our calling as disciples. No, it is only in fulfilling God's calling on our lives that we become persons, individuals, that we have an identity only in fulfilling our call. In Cost of Discipleship, Bonhoeffer has an entire chapter on discipleship and the individual. Bart does not sugarcoat or minimize the cost of fulfilling this task and the danger of the battle, nor does he try to lure Bonhoeffer back by any prospect of victory. Rather, he says this: I cannot really give you the prospect of taking part in a triumph when I ask you to return to Germany. Here, everything is as difficult and unpleasant as you can imagine. And as far as one engages in tactical or historical, philosophical thought, even a little bit, one can realize every moment that the sea rages and will have its victims. In spite of all efforts, the German church is still lost. Isn't this amazing? Bart recognizes as early as November 1933 that in spite of all efforts, the German church is still lost, that the situation was hopeless, impossible, a lost cause, humanly speaking. But as Calvin says, the history of the church is a history of 1,000 resurrections. The church can not only look dead, but be dead and be awakened. Yet he not only continues the fight to bear witness, to stay faithful, to do his duty, but he encourages others to do the same. And he says this. Notice, Bart admits his own struggle against weariness, referring to some of his own writings as an example. And he says this, he says, you will see how much trouble I myself have had in becoming weary. But you see, one simply cannot become weary just now. Still less may one go to England. What in all the world would you want to do over there? Be glad that I do not have you here in person, for I would confront you even more intensely in quite a different way, with the demand that you must now let go of all these intellectual flourishes and special considerations, however interesting they may be, and think of only one thing: that you are a German, that the house of your church is on fire, that you know enough and can say enough what you know well enough to be able to help, and that you must really return to your post by the next ship. Well, shall we say the ship after next? But I cannot tell you emphatically and urgently enough that you belong to Berlin and not to London. Bart saves his most importunate plea for last. Think of only one thing: that you are a German. Bart was Swiss, and he was reminding Bonhoeffer that he was a German, and that the house of your church is on fire, and that you know enough and can say enough what you know well enough to be able to help. There's a lot of talk today about Christian nationalism. Neither Bart nor Bonhoeffer were Christian nationalists in the sense that they absolutized or divinized nationhood, entertained romantic forms of nationalism, or thought that they owed unconditional allegiance to their respective nations. On the contrary, both not only delineated the limits of state power, but stated conditions when it could be actively resisted. Nevertheless, both insisted the church has a divine responsibility to the state and a divine obligation to acknowledge its gratitude for the state, as the 5th article of the Barmen Declaration makes clear. Moreover, both insisted that Christians have civic duties, responsibilities to one's fellow citizens, and that there is a proper form of patriotism and gratitude to one's for one's own country, and yet also of responsibility. Thus Barth's charge to Bonhoeffer, think of only one thing, that you are a German, was to remind him of his responsibility to his people. But if Christians have a responsibility to their country, how infinitely and incommensurably greater is their responsibility to the church. Barth reminds Bonhoeffer that he has an obligation to his church. To all the reasons or excuses which you might perhaps still be able to put in front of me, he said, I will give you only one answer, and the German church, and the German church. And here at the end, he says, think of only one thing, that you are a German, and the house of your church is on fire. Barth was reminding Bonhoeffer of his responsibility to the church. Not the church in some vague, abstract, esoteric sense, but the church in a definite, specific, concrete sense. Not the church in general, but the church in particular. Not only the ecumenical community, but Bonhoeffer's own church in Germany. The church that had baptized him, had nurtured him, catechized and confirmed him, had ordained him, commissioned and sent him, and to which he had taken vows. That church. There's a danger, a common occupational hazard, you might call it, among high-minded academic intellectual types to sort of float off into the clouds when it comes to the church. You can see it in most seminaries or divinity schools in America today. There's a temptation to turn the church into an idea, a concept, a theory, and usually one that serves one political or ideological agenda or another. Likewise, there's a temptation for many of us today to think of the church primarily as a spiritual reality rather than a physical, embodied reality. Barth was calling Bonhoeffer back to this reality, to the fully divine and fully human reality of the one true church. We'll talk more about that tomorrow, but Barth reminded him of his duty, not only to the global church or to a single congregation, but to his own national geographic church, the house of his own church. It's sometimes easier to think of ourselves as global Christians when the house of our own church is on fire. It's easier to think about all the wonderful things God is doing in the global church, and we should and be so grateful for all that the Lord has done and is doing in the global church, but not at the expense of being the church where we are and facing squarely the temptations of our own church. Certainly, we should not waver one iota in our support for missions. But is there anything better, anything more important we could do for the global church than to stand faithful and unwavering in our commitment to live under the authority of Scripture and under our confessions, and to take our ordination vows seriously, come what may? We get emails from all over the country, people who all over the world that get Theology Matters, and this came from Kenya yesterday. I'll just read it to you. Yesterday, it says, we have long appreciated the work of Theology Matters in contending for the faith and promoting sound doctrine. In a landscape where theological clarity is often clouded by syncretism or the prosperity gospel, your commitment to the faith once for all delivered to the saints. We have been grateful for your commitment to the faith once delivered to the saints. It's easier to go global when the local is hard, miserable, stubborn, wayward, and recalcitrant. It's easier to love the invisible church when the visible church is so full of spots and wrinkles and downright mean. It's easier to love the ideal church, the church of our wish dream, than the real church, the church for which Christ died. Bart concluded his letter, as all that you really wrote to me was that you were now over there. This time all that I will write to you is that you ought to be in Berlin. But then he added this statement. He said, you will understand it in the friendly spirit in which it is intended. If I were not so attached to you, I would not go after you in this way. With sincere regards, Karl Barth. Bonhoeffer had asked for a sharp word, and he got one. And yet Barth had a deep affection for him, and this was not the end, but only the beginning of their relationship, really. It was also only the beginning of Bonhoeffer's journey in finding the courage to stand. Barth's letter certainly made an impression on him, and it is hard to imagine it did not shake him. Indeed, he was so impressed that he sent Barth's letter to his father, the renowned psychiatrist, perhaps for analysis. And the world-renowned psychiatrist observed, "It is striking testimony to a fiery spirit." Do you remember? I said biographers claim Bonhoeffer's father was ambivalent toward religion, if not agnostic. Well, here's what the world-renowned psychiatrist wrote to his son Dietrich not long after commenting on Barth's letter. He said this: "When you made up your mind to study theology, I sometimes could not help thinking that it would be a pity for you to have the quiet, uneventful life of a minister, such as I knew my Schwabian uncles had. As far as it being uneventful is concerned, I was greatly mistaken. I had no conception, with my scientific background, that nowadays there could be such a crisis in the ecclesiastical sphere, too." Karl Bonhoeffer was not the only scientist or agnostic to wake up to a deeper crisis facing Germany as a consequence of the witness of his son and the confessing church in the 1930s. There were many scientists and agnostics who were awakened as a consequence of the witness of the confessing church in the 1930s. And this witness, and it's this witness that I'd like to talk with you more about tomorrow. Thank you. Thank you.